Well, hello and welcome to Rossington Community Baptist Church. It's lovely that you've joined us on YouTube, whether you be associated with the church, with another church or no church at all. You're very welcome. And it is our prayer, my prayer, that you would be encouraged and maybe challenged as we look at the scriptures together, something of what God has left for us in His Word. So I pray, Father, that you would indeed speak to us, that you would help us to grasp, to wrestle, and to relax in what your word teaches us today. In Jesus' name, Amen. Now, I wonder if you would consider yourself to be woke. Have you heard that word, woke? It's quite a modern expression, and it refers to being aware of prejudice of one sort or another. So somebody who is woke is aware of prejudice, will point it out, will seek not to display any prejudice, and will also tell other people when they're being racist or whatever the prejudice is. You see, I think we all have certain assumptions about how other people, other groups of people, other types of people behave, about how they think and their attitudes and things like this. I've lived all over the world, and I've found this to be true pretty much everywhere I've gone. Of course, recently, this last couple of weeks, we've had a problem, an issue in British culture with the chairman of the Football Association, Greg Clark, coming a cropper because he was clearly not woke, because he displayed, probably inadvertently, what is referred to as casual racism. But we also carry expectations about what we think or how we think God will behave, what his attitudes are, what he's like. But one lovely thing about life is that very often we find our assumptions, our stereotypes, get challenged. From time to time they even get completely upended. So why is the country at the moment so enamoured with this millionaire footballer, Marcus Rashford? Well, I think it's partly because he has not been behaving and talking the way we expect Premier League footballers to do so. I expect them, to be honest, to be very egocentric, very narcissistic, to just be concerned with their image and how they're seen, how they're portrayed, on social media particularly, and they love their flashy cars, their ostentatious houses, their girlfriend has got to have the latest £5,000 handbag on her arm, and they're constantly taking pictures and videos of themselves. This is a stereotype that I have. But Marcus Rashford has gone against that, hasn't he? Because he has shown recently, this last month or so, that he is very concerned about the poor, about those in our culture, our society, who are struggling, especially children struggling to eat. And it's because as he grew up, they had a real financial need in their household. Now, I know not all footballers are completely selfish, and but Marcus Rashford is not the only one. There are those I've heard of who will send their enormous salaries back to the village where they came from to help them develop. But generally speaking, I think, I certainly have this idea in my head about what Premier League footballers are like. I'm sure Marcus Rashford enjoys his £10 million a year salary. And I'm sure he has got nice cars and big houses and enjoys a lavish lifestyle. But it's lovely to see this other side of him as well. He goes against the stereotype. Another stereotype which we can find ourselves having is regarding politicians. To fall into a lazy stereotype of saying they're all the same, they're all just out for themselves, they're all deceitful, they're all manipulative, they're all just trying to climb the greasy pole. I don't know if you saw the latest drama called Roadkill. in which Hugh Laurie plays a politician, and at one point in the drama he's having a conversation with somebody who's well used to the corridors of power, and this person looks him in the eye and says, "It is a fact that every politician is aiming at Downing Street. Every politician wants to become Prime Minister." And he looks Hugh Laurie coldly in the eye and he says, "Without exception." Is that a fair caricature, a fair appraisal of all politicians? No, I don't believe it is. I can think of two particularly who I've noticed who really impressed me. Many years ago now, I went to hear the MP for Bolsover speak, Dennis Skinner, and I was struck by when he said he didn't understand why some MPs have lots of directorships in outside companies, and some have TV contracts and things like this. He said he didn't understand that. He said he earned more than enough money for a comfortable life. He said his work was rich and fulfilling and busy, representing the people of Bolsover. He didn't have time left over, if he could do a good job of representing the people, to go off and do other things. And he always struck me as a man in politics who was there to try to help his people, and that was as far as it went. He wasn't interested in climbing the greasy pole. Another politician who impressed me several years ago now was Estelle Morris. Estelle Morris was a school teacher. She involved in education, and then she entered politics, and she ended up in the cabinet of the government, Tony Blair's government. And she was involved in the Department of Education, which is her love, her passion, and she loved her job and she really enjoyed it. And then she was promoted to be Secretary of State for Education, so the top of that particular poll. But she resigned shortly afterwards because she said she wasn't up to the job. It needed somebody else in that role who was better suited to the job. She loved being number 2 in the department, but she didn't want to be number 1. That's 2 MPs who've gone against the stereotype, perhaps. Well, let's come to the scriptures, thinking about these things, and read about an event in Jesus' life. This is the second half of Mark chapter 7. The first half of Mark chapter 7, which we thought about last week, Jesus was talking about what is pure and impure in God's eyes. What is clean, what is spiritually unclean. And he said, essentially said, it's not what's on the outside of you, what you do, how you wash your hands, for example, but it's what's in your heart. That's what he taught. And now we see what happens next. Jesus left that place. This is Mark chapter 7, verse 24. Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the child out of her daughter, to drive the demon out of her daughter. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Lord, she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he told her, for such a reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She went home and she found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside away from the crowd, Jesus put his finger into the man's ears. Then he spat and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosed, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He makes even the deaf hear and the mute speak. So, as I said, the first half of the chapter, Jesus talked about what is pure and impure. And here in the second half of the chapter, we see him living out what he just taught. And see, let me explain to you. He performs these two great miracles. He releases a little girl from the power of evil, and he heals a man who is deaf and therefore unable to speak. Now, it's wonderful when Jesus heals people, and we rejoice with the individuals who Jesus touched and spoke to and healed and reconciled and restored. But in the Bible, the gospel writers, the four accounts of the life of Jesus, they did not just write a comprehensive list of everything Jesus said and did, and in the order in which he did them. They constructed their books, their narratives. They chose what to put in and what to leave out. John, at the end of his gospel, says there was so much that Jesus said and did. He supposed not all the libraries in the world can contain it all. Obviously, he was exaggerating, hyperbole, but the point is very clear. He has picked certain things which Jesus said and did to put into his account. And then also the different gospel writers chose some things and left other things. So sometimes there's things in one gospel or two gospels or three gospels which are not in the others. And sometimes the order is different because the writers are constructing their narrative. John, at the beginning of his gospel, he describes, and then as the gospel goes through, he says the miracles that Jesus performed were not just miracles, they were signs. They were indicating something else. He chose the miracles to include in his narrative that were signposts to point to something bigger, something better, something else. The miracle itself was wonderful, but they were indicative of something else. So what does all this mean? Well, firstly, we need to notice where these miracles occurred, these two miracles. The first one was in Tyre, in Samaria. Samaritans were not trusted by the Jews at all, which is why Jesus chose a Samaritan in his parable of how to be a good neighbour, because the Jewish people had a prejudice against the Samaritans. But this lady was a Samaritan. She lived in Samaria. She was a Gentile. Now, the thing about Gentiles in the Jewish mindset, they aren't like us, they're not acceptable, they are not worthy. God has no interest in Gentiles, in non-Jews, be it the lady in Samaria or the man who was in the region known as Decapolis. But the religious hierarchy in Jerusalem at that time had this prejudice against these people. Now Jesus is with this lady. Well, first of all, we see that Jesus is in a Gentile home. Well, that's unclean. And then he's talking to a Gentile woman. She is unclean. And she is unaccompanied by a family relative or her husband. She's on her own. She's unclean. And this woman has the audacity to come and talk theology with this Jewish teacher, this Jewish rabbi. And Jesus interacts with her. On first glance, it seems he's been very harsh. He's referring to her, it appears, like a dog. He's calling her a dog. Well, what Jesus is doing, he's taking this attitude that the Jews had towards the Gentiles, towards non-Jewish people, and he's sort of quoting their opinion on the matter. So when he says the bread, that's the blessings of God. The children, giving the bread to the children, the original readers and hearers would have understood that to be the children of God, the children of the people of Israel, God's chosen people, the children. And they'd have understood the dogs as being the non-Jew, the Gentile. So here's Jesus apparently reinforcing this prejudice that the Jews had. Well, that goes against what we know about Jesus, doesn't it, from the rest of the accounts in the Gospels. He wasn't like that. He was loving and open and kind and generous towards all people. We saw that again and again. So what's going on here? Now, the Bible commentators tell me that the word that Mark uses, and Matthew as well, for dog is not the normal word for dog in Greek. It is what grammar experts call a diminutive word. It makes the word smaller, a diminutive expression of the word. So in French, for example, you might know, but they take a word and they add the ending, the suffix et. In Spanish, they put on the end of the word ito. So if a Spaniard says, I have a problemcito, he means I have a little problem. And in English, we often put e on the end of the word. So what Jesus actually said to this woman is referring to her as a doggy. The Gentiles as doggies, which is a lot gentler, isn't it, than dogs. To interact properly with the text, we need to sort of imagine the scene, imagine the situation, put ourselves in the position. So if you think about it, making a film of this scene, the director needs to think about how Jesus and the woman are going to interact. Now, I did think, knowing from knowing the scriptures and what Jesus was like, I don't think it's a stretch to imagine Jesus talking to this lady with a smile on his face, a twinkle in his eye, making good eye contact, and saying, it is not right to take the children's bread and giving it to the doggies. You see? Jesus wasn't reinforcing this non-acceptance of non-Jews. He was engaging the lady in conversation. He was interacting with her, maybe being a little bit provocative. But she was up for the challenge. He knew that. He knew her heart. He knew exactly what she was like. And she then reacted back. Quick thinking. Said, yes, but even the children, even the dogs get to eat the crumbs that the children drop. And he's so impressed with this that he heals her daughter. So she wasn't impure because she was a Gentile. Jesus said, it's the heart that determines your purity, not the externals. Now, the Jewish leaders should have known this, because a very fundamental, foundational text in the Jewish faith is when the prophet Samuel went to anoint the next king of Israel. He went to a man called Jesse's house. And he looked at all the sons, and he said, no, none of these are the man that God has chosen. Have you not got any more sons? And Jesse said, well, there's the boy who's out in the field looking after the sheep. Jesse said, bring him in. And then he anointed this boy, David, as the next king of Israel. The boy who his own father had written off as not worthy looking at. But very importantly, in 1 Samuel 16 verse 7, Samuel says to Jesse, look, people look at the outward appearance of a person, but God looks at the heart. You might think David didn't look like much, but God knew his heart. And of course, King David became one of the greatest characters in the history of Israel, and even wrote the hymn book of the Bible, the book of Psalms. And most of his life, he was a terrific leader, devoted to God. The Pharisees' hearts, however, they were impure. They were cold and harsh and judgmental. The lady's heart was full of faith and open and desperate for Jesus to come in and meet her need. C.S. Lewis, the writer of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and the other Narnia books and many other books, greatly respected figure in Christian history in our country. He's been dead 57 years, but people still quote him and still look to him. I'm going to quote him now. He took this concept and he expressed it in a lovely way. The way C.S. Lewis did it, he took the concept and he turned it on his head. And he said this: a cold, self-righteous prig who regularly goes to church, like a Pharisee, a cold, self-righteous prig who regularly goes to church may be nearer to hell than a prostitute. You see, we'd have thought of expressing it the other way around. It could be that a prostitute is nearer to heaven than this religious, self-righteous prig, but he puts it on his head. But don't forget the rest of what he said. A cold, self-righteous prig who regularly goes to church may be nearer to hell than a prostitute, but, he said, but, of course, it is better to be neither. No, neither of them are good things. But he's making the point, the same point that Jesus made, the same point as Samuel made, so God looks at the heart, not the externals. And the second miracle is very similar with this man who is deaf and therefore unable to speak. He's also a Greek. He's on the other side of the Jordan in the area known as Decapolis, 10 cities, Decapolis. It's another miracle of compassion for the non-Jew. This man was well loved. All the people begged Jesus to heal him. He was well loved. Now often when we've had real problems in life, or life has dealt us a terrible blow of one sort or another, we can be bitter, we can be angry, we can be resentful, we can be petulant, we can wallow in our own self-pity. Well, that doesn't lead to people loving you, does it? So obviously this man had a great attitude and he was well loved in the area, in his community. He was a child of God. But the Pharisees, they couldn't see that. They were too busy writing their rules and frowning at people who didn't come up to their considered standards. Even those miraculously healed by Jesus, miraculously restored, they were so entrenched they just criticized them again and again. Now C.S. Lewis had great spiritual insight, great wisdom. He was a master at writing, and he is well beloved. But when you look closer at C.S. Lewis, you discover things which make you uncomfortable. Things that make me uncomfortable. For example, he was a very heavy smoker, which we in the Christian church, we don't really like that. We don't think it's a good idea. But he smoked, believe it or not, 60 a day. I was brought up as a child in a house full of smoke. My father was on 50 a day, so I know a bit like, I can imagine what C.S. Lewis's house was like, very unpleasant. He also drank more than Christians would normally, and certainly more than what we would consider acceptable to drive. And his theology in places is not biblical. I remember reading The Great Divorce, which is his book about what happens to us after death and the judgment, etc. I read that book and I thought there's bits in here which are not biblical. I cannot see them as being biblical. Which was shocking to me, really. Surprising, because this is C.S. Lewis. There's also a relationship he had with an older woman. He had promised her son, should the son die, next to C.S. Lewis in the trenches of World War I, that C.S. Lewis promised him that should he die, he would look after his mother, Mrs. Moore. And he did look after her all her days. But there are, I won't go into it, but there are big question marks over his relationship with her. And as he looked back later, after becoming a true Christian and looking back at the relationship later, he was ashamed of something in that relationship. And he described himself as being without moral conscience as could be. We don't know. And other things in relationships as well, with C.S. Lewis were not as good as they could have been. But what do? Do we reject everything C.S. Lewis said and wrote and did? on the basis of his flaws and his failings, and he's also been a man of his time? Or do we rejoice and celebrate and learn from, glean that which was good and positive and helpful and biblical? Well, I would say you can't just throw out the baby with the bathwater. If that's your attitude, then you never learn anything from anyone. Because everyone, every Christian leader, every Christian writer, every Christian filmmaker, every Christian influencer of any sort has got flaws and failings and blind spots, etc. And also, to reject everybody would put yourself in the position of judge and say, I know better than God. God who chose to take that person and use them in certain ways, etc. So when I think of these healings, it reminds me that God's love is bigger and reaches further than I imagine it. He will reach out and draw to himself and restore and forgive, save who he will, regardless of my lazy stereotyping and prejudice. Even those who I consider not to be worthy, but I need to remember that I am not worthy of God's love and grace and forgiveness and patience. By no means am I worthy, so how can I say that somebody else isn't either? Also, as I comment quite often in the scriptures, you see that the people who Jesus reacted with and brought close to God and brought healing, often they knew very, very little of the whole Christian thing. These two characters we thought about today, we don't know, but do we imagine they knew the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, their foundational scriptures? Do they know them inside out? Could they understand the great overarching themes of the scriptures? Had they wrestled with the original texts and understood them? I very much doubt it. Had they thought through the tricky questions which people like to throw up as excuses of why not to consider Christ? No. Yeah, I'll confess to you now, but if you asked me to go through the Old Testament and write down all 39 books in order, I think I would eventually get there, at least to the 39. It'll take me a while, but I'll get the 39, and I won't get them in the right order. I know that. I'll get some of them wrong. No, you don't have to know everything before receiving Jesus, before trusting in his death, before accepting the forgiveness and the grace which he offers us. You learn as you grow. You learn as you move forward. You're growing. You're born again, as Jesus put it, as a baby in Christ, as Paul put it. And of course, babies don't know everything, but they grow as they go. So I'm encouraged and I'm challenged. I'm encouraged because God's grace, saving grace, is available to all, even the most unlikely of people, in my opinion. I'm challenged because I can be that cold, self-righteous prig. I can consider myself closer to God than other people. I can even consider myself a little bit worthy of receiving from God and somebody else not being. I can be a cold, self-righteous prig who regularly goes to church and my heart at times is far from where it should be. I want other people to look at me and interact with me and get to know me and glean what is good from me. What is good in my attitude, what is good in my behaviour, what is good in my words. And I want them to just leave this stuff that's not so good. I don't want them to reject me on the basis of my failings, my flaws, my weaknesses. And therefore I should treat other people the same. They be very high profile, like C.S. Lewis and many other Christian leaders, or they be just somebody I know down the road, or anywhere in between. I'm challenged to look for the good, to learn from what is good in them and to be encouraged and challenged by that, and just let the not so good, just leave it to one side. That's between them and God. So I need to not only marvel at God's grace and love and forgiveness of myself, I need to have an attitude that looks to other people, regardless of who they might be, regardless of the stereotype I might expect them to fill. I need to be more woke. Am I woke enough? God bless you, and I pray that you'll be encouraged and you'll be aware of God's love and grace towards you.